I was sitting at the far end of my son's birthday dinner wearing the blue cardigan Daniel had given me 3 Christmases ago, when his wife turned from the other end of the table and said, loudly enough for 30 people to hear, loudly enough that the nearest waiter stopped mid-step, "She does not belong here. People like her ruin everything." I had never, in 64 years of life, been spoken about as though I were a misplaced piece of furniture someone had forgotten to throw out. But what Victoria did not know, what she had never once thought to ask in 3 years of marriage to my son, was that the gleaming shopping center, where her precious boutique occupied its prime corner unit, had been registered in the name of my family trust since 1987. The dinner was on a Saturday evening. By Monday morning, I had made exactly 1 phone call. My name is Margaret Whitmore. Most people who have known me longer than 5 minutes call me Maggie. I raised Daniel alone after his father passed. Harold died of a heart attack in the autumn of 1998, when Daniel was 11 and still small enough that his feet didn't quite reach the floor when he sat in the kitchen chairs. Harold had been a quiet, careful man who read the fine print on every contract and believed that real wealth was not something you announced, but something you protected, steadily, patiently, the way you tend a garden no one else can see. He left me the house on Birchwood Lane and a portfolio of commercial real estate he had assembled over 20 years, property by property, always held in trust, always below the radar. I kept that portfolio. I dressed in cardigans and took the bus and brought homemade pie to the neighbors on their birthdays, because Harold had also taught me that the people who know what you're worth will try to take it from you, and the people who don't know will leave you in peace. For a long time, I was left entirely in peace. Daniel grew up well, earnest, kind, the sort of boy who called his mother every Sunday without being reminded. He became a structural engineer, moved to the city, and when he was 32, he called me on a Sunday evening with a new quality to his voice, higher-pitched, almost surprised by his own happiness, and told me he had met someone. Her name was Victoria. She worked in fashion and had, in Daniel's words, a very clear vision for her life. I remember sitting on the back porch watching the evening light go amber across Harold's old rose garden and feeling something I couldn't quite name. Not dread, something quieter. Something that settled below the surface of his excitement, like a stone in shallow water, cold, patient, and still. I met Victoria 6 weeks later. She was beautiful in the deliberate way of someone who has constructed a version of themselves that reads as effortless. Hair perfect, posture flawless, smile arriving and departing with precise timing. She ordered the most expensive wine on the menu without glancing at the price. When I ordered tea, her eyes dropped to my cardigan for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. It was the survey of a person accustomed to assessing things quickly, what something is worth, whether it belongs, what to do with it. "Daniel talks about you constantly," she said, in a tone suggesting she found this mildly inconvenient. I told her I was glad. I told her it was lovely to meet her. I meant both. They were married 14 months later at a hotel I had never heard of. The invitation described the decor as modern luxury. Victoria's mother gave a speech mentioning the family's legacy of excellence 4 times in 8 minutes. I sat at the family table and clapped at the right moments and focused on Daniel's face, which was bright with a happiness so genuine it was almost painful to look at directly. The first year of their marriage was manageable, which sometimes means quietly painful. Victoria did not call me by any name. When forced to acknowledge me in Daniel's presence, she used the third person even when I was standing 2 feet away. "Does she take sugar?" she would ask him, as though I had lost both voice and name somewhere between the front door and the kitchen. I understood this was intentional. I also understood that naming it would make me the difficult one. So I let it pass, the way you let small cruelties pass when the cost of naming them is the peace of someone you love. It was the questions about the house that first made the stone at the bottom of the water feel heavier. About 8 months into the marriage, during a Sunday lunch, when Daniel had stepped from the room, Victoria asked me, pleasantly, one hand resting on the counter, whether I had ever seriously considered downsizing. The house on Birchwood Lane was large for one person, she said. 4 bedrooms, that garden. Surely at my age, and she leaned on that phrase with the precision of a surgeon making the first incision, a smaller apartment would be far more manageable, somewhere with a community of people in a similar stage of life. I told her the house had been in my family for 30 years and that I managed it perfectly well. She smiled, that particular smile of hers, the one that lived only in her mouth, and said, of course. She was only thinking of my comfort. Daniel returned. She handed him a glass of wine, and the conversation moved on, and I sat with my cooling tea and heard Harold's voice in the back of my mind, low and unhurried. People who know what you're worth will try to take it. The questions continued over the following months, always changing shape, always carrying the same pressure underneath. A comment about how much property values on Birchwood had risen. A suggestion that Daniel might benefit from a stable property base. Wouldn't it be natural, she said, for a family home to stay in the family rather than be sold to strangers someday? Daniel nodded with the discomfort of a man who has been briefed in advance and is hoping the conversation ends without incident. I noticed that he did not meet my eyes. I noticed that she noticed. And I began, very quietly, to pay a different kind of attention. There was an afternoon in March, about 6 months before the birthday dinner, that I have thought about many times since. I had come by to drop off some of Daniel's old photographs that I had found while organizing a closet. Birthday parties, school plays, one of Harold pushing him on a bicycle with both hands, and the widest grin I had ever seen on a man who rarely smiled in photographs. Victoria wasn't home. Daniel let me in and made tea, and for a while it was almost like the old Sundays. Him at the counter, me at the kitchen table, the comfortable rhythm of a mother and son in a shared space. Then his phone rang and he stepped out of the room to answer it, and I sat with my tea and let my eyes move around the kitchen the way they do when you have an empty moment in a space that isn't yours. On the counter near the refrigerator was a yellow legal pad, the top sheet covered in Daniel's handwriting. Neat columns, figures, something that looked like a financial calculation. I didn't move toward it. I didn't need to. I could read the top line from where I sat. Birchwood estimated current value. Below it, a number with 6 figures. Below that, in Victoria's handwriting, tighter, more angular, the words split evenly. I heard Daniel's voice in the hallway, low and agreeable, wrapping up the call. I picked up the photograph of Harold and the bicycle and turned it over in my hands. When Daniel came back, I handed him the stack of photographs and told him his father would have been very proud of him. He looked at the top image for a long moment and then looked up at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Gratitude and guilt braided together in a way that made my chest hurt. I drove home through the evening traffic and sat in Harold's armchair for a long time without turning the lights on. That autumn, Victoria opened a boutique, women's fashion, high-end accessories, the kind of store whose window displays are themselves a declaration about money. It was called Vive and was located in the Meridian Shopping Center on the west side of the city, a property I knew very well for reasons I saw no reason to share. I should tell you something about the Meridian Shopping Center. Harold purchased the land in 1991, developed it through 1993, and when he died, it passed into the Harold and Margaret Whitmore Family Trust, of which I am the sole trustee. The center had been managed for decades by a property firm, and the tenants paid rent through standard commercial leases, dealing with the management company rather than with me directly. My name appeared nowhere in their paperwork. That was, as Harold always said, precisely the point. Victoria had been operating Viv for 11 months before she made the mistake of humiliating me at Daniel's birthday dinner. Aurum was the kind of restaurant that printed its dress code on a card near the entrance and employed staff who refilled your water before you knew it needed refilling. Victoria had organized everything: the venue, guest list, menu, seating chart. 30 people attended. I came by taxi, November cold pressing against the cab windows, wearing the blue cardigan because it was Daniel's favorite. He had chosen it himself, holding it up with the quiet certainty of a son who knows his mother's taste better than most people know their own. I was seated at the far end of the table, beside a colleague I had never met, and an empty chair that remained empty all evening. Victoria was at the opposite end, luminous in ivory and precisely structured, the kind of dress that communicates its own price. She greeted me with a kiss, placed in the air beside my cheek, and the same pleasant distant smile, the kind that conveys presence without warmth, like a room with the lights on and no one in it. Dinner was served. Speeches were given. Daniel looked pleased and mildly overwhelmed in the way of people being celebrated in a key that doesn't quite match them. I watched him from my end and thought about the boy who used to fall asleep in Harold's car on Sunday drives, entirely boneless, his cheek pressed against the window, trusting the motion of the car to carry him wherever he needed to go. I was in the middle of that thought when it happened. I had quietly asked a waiter whether there was any plain bread available, as the rosemary focaccia on the table gives me headaches. A small, utterly unremarkable request. The waiter nodded and stepped away, and I settled my hands in my lap. And that was when Victoria's voice cut across the room, not low, not discreet, pitched with the deliberate clarity of someone who wants every person in the room to hear. "For heaven's sake!" She was looking directly at me, expression tilted with light amusement, something theatrical in it, a performance for the room she'd already decided she owned. "This is Aurum, not a canteen." A pause for the room to register it. Then, "Some people simply don't know where they belong. People like her. Honestly, Daniel, I've said it before, this kind of thing reflects on all of us." 30 people found sudden urgent interest in their plates, their wine glasses, the middle distance. I heard someone set a fork down. The silence that filled the table was of the particular kind that forms when a room full of people agree, without speaking, to pretend they didn't hear what they just heard. I looked at Daniel. Something moved across his face, a quick, involuntary contraction, like a flinch happening below the surface. He opened his mouth. A breath came out. He looked down at his plate. He said nothing. That silence, his silence, was louder than anything she had said. I did not cry. I did not stand. I felt heat rise to my face and then felt something older and colder move through me, steady and purposeful, the way a current moves through water that appears entirely still on the surface. I thought of Harold. I thought of the Meridian Shopping Center. I thought about the specific clause in every commercial lease my trust's property firm had included for 30 years without variation. The landlord retains the right to review and decline lease renewal with 90 days written notice. No reason required. I picked up my water glass. I took a quiet sip. I set it back down. I turned to the colleague beside me and asked him something about his work. He answered with visible gratitude for the distraction. The table found its footing again, unsteadily, the way rooms do after a door slams. But I was already thinking about Monday morning. The taxi home smelled of pine air freshener and old upholstery, and I sat in the back with my hands folded in my lap and watched the city lights slide past the window without really seeing them. The driver had the radio on low, something soft and wordless, and I was grateful for the sound because my head was not a quiet place at that particular moment. I kept seeing Daniel's face, the way his mouth had opened and nothing had come out, the way his eyes had found his plate as though it contained something of urgent interest. 30 years of raising that boy, every scraped knee and failed exam and heartbreak, every Sunday lunch and quiet hour in the garden when words weren't needed. And in the moment that mattered, he had looked down at his plate. I paid the driver and walked up the path to the house on Birchwood Lane and let myself in through the front door, and the house received me the way it always did. Warm, still, smelling of beeswax polish and the faint ghost of the soup I'd made that morning. I hung up my coat. I put the kettle on. I stood at the kitchen window in the dark and watched the garden and thought, with a clarity that surprised me, that I was not sad. I had expected to be sad. Instead, I felt the cold, focused stillness of someone who has just understood something they should have understood much sooner. I thought about the legal pad on Daniel's kitchen counter. Birchwood estimated current value, split evenly. I thought about the months of careful questions, the consistent pressure, the way Victoria had been working on that particular project, the way you work on a stuck drawer. Never forcing it, always testing, always applying just enough to feel for the point of give. I thought about Daniel's voice in the hallway in March, low and agreeable, wrapping up a call I hadn't been able to hear. I went to Harold's armchair. I sat down. I did not turn the lights on for a long time, and the dark was not unpleasant. On Sunday morning, I called my property solicitor, Graham Fells, a careful, methodical man very much in Harold's mold, who communicated in precise sentences and never used two words when one would do. I had worked with Graham for nearly 20 years, and he knew how I operated. I told him I needed a full review of the Meridian lease, specifically the current tenant in Unit 4, trading as Vive, and the status of their renewal window. He said he would have the information ready for me by Monday morning, first thing. It was Sunday afternoon when Daniel called. His voice had the padded, over-controlled quality of someone who has rehearsed what they are going to say and is hoping the conversation follows the script. "Mum, about last night." "Yes," I said. She didn't mean it the way it came out. You know how she gets when she's stressed. The boutique has been difficult lately, and she'd had a bit to drink, and I think she just... "Daniel," I said, "did you know she was going to say something like that?" Silence, long enough to be its own answer. "I didn't know she was going to say that specifically," he said, which was a very different thing from saying no, and we both knew it. I asked him about the legal pad I had seen in March, the figures, the note in Victoria's handwriting. I kept my voice entirely level. I simply described what I had read and asked him to explain it. The silence that followed had a different texture, longer, heavier, with the particular quality of a person calculating what they can still contain and what is already spilled past the edges. It was nothing, just financial planning. thinking ahead. Nothing was decided. When you say thinking ahead, Daniel, I said, do you mean a future in which I have signed the house over to you and Victoria and moved somewhere convenient? Or a future in which things continue exactly as they are? He didn't answer that directly. He said instead that he had only ever wanted everyone to be taken care of, that Victoria had ideas about how things could be structured more efficiently, that nothing would happen without my full agreement. His voice had the specific hollow quality of a man reciting a position that no longer feels entirely his own, as though he were reading from notes written in someone else's handwriting. When he had finished, I told him that I loved him and that we would speak more soon, and I ended the call and sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment. She had him writing the figures himself, calculating the value and recording it in his own handwriting, in his own kitchen, as though it were a practical kindness being planned. That was what I had not quite allowed myself to see before that evening. Not that Victoria was maneuvering, but that Daniel was not simply failing to stop it. He was at the table. He was holding the pen. Monday morning, I called Graham Fells. He told me the Vive lease in Unit 4 of the Meridian Shopping Center was in its current term, expiring in 4 months. The tenant had submitted a renewal inquiry 3 weeks prior, a standard 2-year renewal at the existing rate, which the management firm had been holding pending trustee instruction. I told Graham to issue the non-renewal notice. Standard 90-day term. No additional commentary required. He paused for exactly one professional moment, the pause of a man who has understood completely what this means and is confirming he has understood it correctly, and said he would have the paperwork processed by end of day. I thanked him and set the phone down and stood for a moment with both hands resting on the cold marble of the kitchen counter. I will not pretend that what I felt was uncomplicated. There was something cold and clear in it, the clarity of a lever finally being applied, but there was also something that ached, because the lever would reach Daniel too, and grief does not evaporate simply because it is justified. I sat with both things. I let them both be true. By Tuesday afternoon, I had a voicemail from Victoria. Her voice had shed its careful polish entirely. She sounded compressed, held together by effort, the way a door sounds when wind is pressing hard against it from the other side. She said she had received a letter from the Meridian property management firm regarding her lease. There must be some kind of mistake. She would appreciate a call back at my earliest convenience. I listened to the message twice. She called 3 more times before evening. On the 4th call, I answered, "Mrs. Whitmore." The remaining polish was completely gone, and what was left was harder, flatter, stripped of pretense. This is harassment. You're doing this because of one comment at a dinner party. You are going to destroy everything I have spent 3 years building because you have a thin skin and a grudge. Victoria, I said, I'm going to stop you there. My own voice surprised me. Steady, unhurried, with a quiet finality I had not heard from myself before. Something herald-shaped, something that had been waiting a long time to be used. I am making a business decision about property that belongs to my family trust. That is entirely within my rights. If your business lacks the financial resilience to relocate to comparable premises, that is a business problem, not a personal one. Those are 2 separate categories. I'd encourage you not to confuse them. You can't just, I can, I said, and I have. You will receive the formal notice through your property manager. The 90 days is a reasonable window. I would suggest you begin your search promptly. I paused, and I let the pause breathe for a moment. I would also suggest, when you have a quiet hour, that you think carefully about what it costs you to speak to people the way you spoke to me on Saturday evening. Not because I require an apology, I genuinely don't at this point, but because you have a long-standing habit of calculating what people are worth before you have done the research. That is, as you are discovering, a very expensive habit. She didn't say anything. I heard her breathing, the specific, controlled breathing of a person with a great many things left to say and no ground left to say them from. Then she hung up. The following week, Daniel came to the house on Birchwood Lane. He came alone, without calling ahead, which meant he had been sitting with what he needed to say for some time and had finally decided to say it in person. I watched him from the kitchen window, just for a moment before I went to the door, and saw his father in the set of his shoulders, in the particular way he stood with his hands at his sides, a man preparing to account for himself. I opened the door and let him in. We sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. I made tea and we drank it, and he told me things he should have told me months earlier. That Victoria had been working on the house plan since the first year of their marriage. That she had talked about it as a matter of when, rather than if, framing it as responsible long-term planning. That he had participated in the calculations because he had told himself it was theoretical, a conversation, not a plan, and that nothing would happen without my agreement. He said he had repeated this to himself so many times it had started to feel like a boundary he was holding rather than a line he had already crossed. He could not look at me when he said any of this. I let him not look at me. He needed somewhere to put his eyes, and I understood that. I had needed somewhere to put mine, more than once in the last 3 years. I asked him one question, whether at any point he had intended to actually present me with those figures, whether the plan had a step beyond the yellow legal pad. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said that Victoria had spoken of it as something that would happen when the time was right, and that he had never told her it wouldn't, and that, he now understood, was the same as agreeing. I told him I forgave him, because I did, and because he was my son, and because grief and forgiveness can occupy the same space without canceling each other out. I told him what happened between him and Victoria was his decision to make. I told him the house was mine, would remain mine as long as I chose to keep it, and that the subject was permanently closed. He nodded. He looked, for the first time in 2 years, like a man standing in his own shoes. Viv closed 11 weeks after the non-renewal notice was delivered. Victoria had not found comparable alternative premises. The equivalent spaces in the city were significantly more expensive than the Meridian lease had been, and her margins had been considerably thinner than the boutique's polished aesthetic suggested. Daniel told me this without commentary, in the level tone one uses when reporting something that has already been fully absorbed. I said I was sorry to hear it, which was only partially true, and he said he knew, which suggested he understood things more clearly than he once had. 3 months after that, he called on a Sunday evening. The call had a different quality than the calls of the previous year. Quieter, less careful in the rehearsed sense, more careful in the genuine one. The texture of 2 people finding their way back to each other across cleared and honest ground. He asked if he could come for lunch the following weekend. I said yes. I told him I'd make the apple cake, the one his father had always loved. He said that sounded really good. I hang up the phone and stand at the kitchen window for a moment, looking out at Harold's rose garden. It is early spring and the first new growth is showing, tentative, persistent, the kind of green that arrives before you're entirely ready for it. The house smells of beeswax and coffee and the apple cake cooling on the rack beside the stove. The afternoon light comes through the kitchen glass and makes a long gold rectangle on the floor, and the house is quiet and warm and entirely mine. Harold used to say that power doesn't announce itself. It simply is, and when you need it, it is there. I think about that a great deal these days. I think about Victoria standing in this kitchen the one time she came, her eyes moving across the room the way they always did, cataloging, appraising, already dividing it in her mind into portions. She had seen a house. She had never once thought to ask whose. I go back to the counter. I pour a cup of tea. I sit at the table where Daniel and I will sit next Sunday, and I let the morning be quiet and good. Some houses know who they belong to, and some people learn that lesson later than others.